So, I'm going to tell you a story about Giles Corey. And he was a man in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the early 1600s. This was during the time of the Salem witch trials. And they had rules at the Salem witch trials. So, if you were to, say, be accused of being a witch, you'd be tried. And if you were convicted, you would be burned at the stake or hung. Usually it was hung, actually. Burned at the stake was more of an England thing. But anyway, you would be executed for being a witch. If you said you were innocent, then you would go to trial. The witnesses would testify against you. They would find that you were a witch anyway. And then you would be killed for being a witch and lying about being a witch. So Giles Corey had this thing where he had this idea that he wouldn't say he was guilty, he wouldn't say he was not guilty. So they bring him to trial. Are you guilty of being a witch? And he said nothing. And they decided, okay, they were going to torture him until he either said he was a witch or he wasn't a witch. And so the way they tortured him was they did something called pressing. So they took him, they strung him, they laid him down on the ground, stretched his arms and legs out so he couldn't move. And they put a board on top of his chest. And then on top of the board, they put weights. So they put a big stone, and then put another big stone and another big stone. And what this does is this compresses the chest, and it's uncomfortable. It's not pleasant. But the real thing is that it compresses the lungs and it keeps you from breathing. So you die this slow death of suffocation because you only have so much to breathe in. It takes so much more effort to breathe, and it's so much harder to breathe. So that what happens is you're sitting here and you can try to breathe and you can breathe a little bit, but you can't breathe enough so that it stops hurting because the carbon dioxide builds up in your blood because you can only breathe in and out so much. So you can't get a full lungful. You can only get a quarter or an eighth, just the tiniest bit of air, just enough to keep you awake, but not enough to stop the CO2 buildup. So it feels like your body is on fire because what happens is the CO2 goes into carbolic acid in the bloodstream and forms, carbolic acid. So carbolic acid is, an acid. And it feels like you're on fire. It feels like your whole body's being dipped in acid because, in a way, that's what it is. So if you go and you hold your breath, that burning sensation in your lungs, that burning sensation that you feel while you hold your breath, this is what that guy was facing. And they kept putting more weight on him. And they said, okay, are you a witch or not? And his last words were, more weight. It's like, I'm not going to tell you. And so Giles Corey has one of the greatest last words ever. And it's more weight. And it's like, okay, torture me all you want. Now, the guy in the torture chamber is in much the same situation. Because if he says, no, I didn't kill the deer, then the queen is going to say, oh, I have this witness that says you did, you're going to die. Or he says, yes, I did kill the deer. And the queen says, oh, I have this, you killed the deer, so I'm going to kill you. And so no matter what he said, he was going to be executed. And then all of his property, his house, and all that stuff was going to be seized. So the only way he could keep the house for his wife, the only way his wife would be able to survive, his wife and his little child would be able to survive, was if he were to hold out to the torture. Or somehow, as if he would be tortured to death, because he wouldn't have been convicted, he wouldn't have been tried. And there's all sorts of cases, like there are a number of cases where people have killed themselves before verdicts or have died before verdicts are final in order to keep stuff for their families. And it's really kind of horrible that society can cause things like that to happen. But in his case, it's like he's going to die anyway. And, once you die, does it really matter how you died? Yeah, it's unpleasant while you're dying, but once you're dead, you're dead. So that's one of the things, Giles Corey. And this is, it also kind of shows there's the sort of hypocrisy in here of the queen, the sorceress Morgan Le Fay, because she's willing to kill him, but she's not willing to kill him in such a way that he can't receive forgiveness. Because in the Catholic faith, there's a whole bunch of rituals about confession and absolution, and it's worse to kill somebody if they haven't been absolved of their sins. And during the Crusades, this went to insane levels. One of the things that they did during the Crusades was they had this mace, big weight at the end of a stick. But inside of the mace was holy water. It had been blessed by a priest. So there was water at the end of the mace. It had been blessed by a priest. And the idea is that if you hit a pagan with it, you're actually baptizing them as you are killing them. Which was just this one of these crazy things that they came up with. And it's like, you're killing the guy. Doesn't make sense. Another thing in this chapter, this is what started it out. This is my first thought when I was reading through this chapter, was it talked about how, here you have Morgana demanding the boss kill somebody just to show he can. So at some point, he's going to have to invent a gun. He's going to have to start carrying the gun around just to be able to shoot people and break things. It's like, oh, this is what I can do. And he shoots and puts a nice little hole in a block of wood or shatters a bottle or whatever. Especially like if it black powder and this huge cloud of fire comes out of it. But a great muzzle flash because, that's impressive. Or a flamethrower. He needs to do a flamethrower. Anyway. So here it was. She was demanding, you got to kill somebody for me. I got to see you kill somebody. I just want to see this. And then all of a sudden the bells rang for mass and everybody went off. And just, he's talking about the hypocrisy of this. And there's a very similar situation in the book Candide by Voltaire, where you have these two armies fighting. Then all of a sudden it's noon, or I can't remember the time of the day. It's a particular hour. And then all the priests come up and they say their mass. And people, take the mass all together. And then once that's done, they get back to fighting. And Voltaire was like, this is insane. And yeah, it kind of is insane. But here you have Morgan Le Fay, and she's like, kill the guy. Ding dong. Oh, time for church. Go off to church. Now, the question is how much of it she believed. And how much of it was something which is called virtue signaling. Now, this is where you say something or do something without really believing it, but you do it in order to be seen to be doing it. And, in order to say that you did it. And so one of the great things along these lines is when Toyota made the Prius, they told the designers, we don't want it to look like anything else. And so you have the Prius with the high back. And it has a high back, and it's not quite a hatchback, and it's not quite shaped like anything else. And you look at it and you go, that's a Prius. And it's one of those cars that just stands out. So, it's like if you saw an Edsel, you would say, oh, that's an Edsel, because the Edsel stood out. And the Hudson Hornet stood out. And the Tucker stood out. I mean, you looked at it, it's like, oh my goodness, that's a Tucker. And you just see it, and you're like, no, that's that. And the Volkswagen Beetle. Everyone looks at it and goes, oh, that's a Volkswagen Beetle, because it looks like, it's the only thing that looks like that. Well, the Prius was the same way. The designers at Toyota were told, make something that looks completely different. Doesn't have to be aerodynamic. It'd be nice if it were, but it doesn't have to be. Just make sure it looks different. And so they made it look different. And here you had the Prius, and it looked different. And so people would buy the Prius because everyone else would know that they had a hybrid. Even though that there were other hybrids out there on the market with better mileage. It's like, oh, look, it's a Prius. It has better mileage. This person is environmentally conscious. And so as I was reading the chapter, I was like, how much of this Morgan Le Fay going to church is about her showing that she's going? And it's like, oh, yes, go to the morning, go to the evening, have my own private little services in between. Now, at the same time, while she's having the guy tortured to death because he won't confess, it's kind of like, okay, maybe she really does believe it, but then again, she killed people on whims, so maybe she gets off. She enjoys hearing the screams of someone dying because, she did take kind of glee in bringing the boss down to see the guy being tortured. And also, it's impressive how Sandy can throw around, oh, he's the boss, and everyone's like, he's the boss. But the thing is the way that he dunked on Merlin. He's like, okay, I'm going to destroy his castle, and everyone's like, nah. And then boom. I mean, that story travels. And in places like this where people lie, the sound of, just the story is going to go to, he snapped his fingers and all of a sudden the castle exploded and killed 50 people, even though no one was hurt. It's like, oh, it killed 50 people and it transformed into light and flame and it destroyed everything within a mile and it turned a crater and demons came out of the crater and went and destroyed 10 more houses. And so his simple blowing up of a tower would turn into this huge, massive story. And perhaps everyone along the line did the calculus that, I talked about in the previous chapter where it's like, okay, so this is a story of it destroying half the countryside and huge flaming rocks and demons. Well, he probably just wrecked the building and it burned down. Maybe they scale it down to what actually happened. They probably won't scale it down to smaller. But it's just this huge, incredible story. And so everyone's like, this person is capable of insane things. So all Sandy has to do is do this or else he will. And it's also kind of more impressive because it's not him making the threat. It's other people making the threat for him. So he's just sitting here quietly and she's like, he will do this and he will do that and he will do the other thing. And the cows will turn purple. She didn't put that in, but it's like she gives this thing of, this is what he'll do. And he's sitting there like, he doesn't say a thing. And often saying nothing is the most imposing thing. So here she is, she's giving the explanation. She's one of them. She speaks like them. And, no one's going to take the risk because, they've heard the stories. And he's not quite sure what stories they've heard, but, he's heard some he's done some impressive things. So